that we all experience as professionals. So I think within this room, we have a mix of people who are FOIA, who are records managers, and who are e-discovery. One of the things that we have in common, though, is data. And so I think we've been hearing a lot about the future of AI, the future of FOIA, what things are going to look like with FOIA going forward and e-discovery. What we haven't talked about as much is the actual data going into these models and what happens with that data and how to prepare that data for AI. So that's really where I want to focus today, which is a little bit different. So we're going to talk about the untapped power of unstructured data. How many of you feel confident that you know what unstructured data is without peeking and looking at my slide? Like 3 people. Okay, we have sort of a mix of people in the room. I honestly came from the e-discovery space. As an attorney, I have done a lot of evidence processing. I've thought a lot about categorization of evidence. I admittedly did not think about as much of where that evidence lived before and how that evidence was stored and processed. And so that is where we're going to focus a little bit of our start today. So unstructured data is something that we're going to call too cool for columns. This is actually, when you think about data or you think about records, this is really what you're thinking about probably, not structured data. What's ironic about that, and we'll talk about it, is most companies think about structured data, which is not really the data you're thinking about. So unstructured data. This is data that lacks a predefined schema. It's not in a spreadsheet. It's not in a database. It's scattered across all different types of information, and all sorts of nuanced intelligence is in this information. So what are some of those content types? So you think a little bit about this. What's in a spreadsheet? It's a bunch of numbers, it's formulas. It's not really telling you a story necessarily without other context. Whereas in an unstructured data, you actually have quantitative data. This is intelligence. It's information around what the decision, the background behind a decision looked like, the conversation before somebody sends that ultimate email, the draft of a document before it's decided. The reason that unstructured data is not something that we focus on as much is because it's tougher to deal with. If you think about it, structured data lives in predefined categories and fields, whereas unstructured data, it can be kind of anything and anywhere. And so how are you going to locate it, extract that information, and do something meaningful with it? So this is a big deal, something to think about. So as I'm saying that, now that we kind of thought about it, what you should realize is this is the unseen majority. So I think these are some interesting statistics I put up here, but 80 to 90% of the data that's generated today at your agency, at your company, is unstructured data. That volume is continuing to increase exponentially, 55 to 65% year over year. So you can just see it skyrocketing in zettabytes. And I remember 10 years ago, we talked about gigabytes as this terabytes as this large system of measurement. Now imagine we're talking about 200 zettabytes of information. This is just billions and billions and billions and billions of records. What is in that information? So what we see here, 95% of organizations acknowledge this is an issue. We have this information, it's sitting out there. What are we doing about it? And the scary part is only 44% of agencies and companies are actually addressing it. So we know it's there, we know we want something out of it, we're not really doing a lot about it. So that leads us to the kind of discussion about where does this live at your agency? Where does this live at your company? It's not just a federal agency. So you have email communications that have mission critical discussions in them. They have approvals, policy decisions. You have case files that you've generated over the course of your litigation. You have those FOIA responses and requests. All of those things contain agency-specific information and intelligence. It contains information about the way that your agency specifically thinks about things. So this is really nuanced information beyond a spreadsheet. You also have this huge repository of SharePoint documents and Word documents and chat documents. All of those have information that is very valuable. And then specifically in our space, Think about all of the information stored in all of that surveillance, the body cams, the sensors, the surveillance, that's unstructured data, and that it tells a story. So if you are not thinking beyond what I need to do with this from a compliance and privacy perspective, or what I need to do with this data beyond e-discovery production or FOIA production, you are missing an entire story that could help leverage a lot of things for your agency, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what are you missing? And I think this is where we should really realize what you're missing matters. So you are missing the full context, the rationale, the intent, the nuance that those structured fields can't show. That conversation in the email before I send you the spreadsheet that tells you why I did it a certain way. The discussion in the chat about why we're going to make a policy update. Those things are critical. You're also missing information that's across the silos. So if you think about a lot of us in the room, we exist in these isolated capacities, but our work is linked. So if you're doing FOIA, your work is inextricably linked with the e-discovery team or the litigation or legal teams. If you're in records management, those records that you're managing and maintaining become critical for FOIA and e-discovery. And there are all sorts of things happening in these silos, discussions and conversations you don't see if you don't extract the intelligence across the silos. You're also missing risk. So there is, obviously, we're seeing that in the news today, a lot of risk of regulatory exposure. There are compliance gaps at agencies and organizations that you cannot see if you don't look beyond the silos, if you look in these segmented areas. So you really have to be able to piece together all of this information to get the full story. And it's really those records that matter most. The things that you're producing for FOIA, for litigation, are unstructured data. So we keep talking about the output of AI and what comes after you take the data and you get the AI and you have the result, and that's the exciting piece. I think the piece that we have not discussed so far is the governance of the data that goes into that AI. And one of the things that I heard Judge Facciola talk about in the last piece right before Karina was the idea that the ABA is trying to address this. There are ethical concerns about the information that you feed into your generative AI models. If you put privileged information into OpenText or into ChatGPT or whatever model that you're using, that information becomes public. You are potentially exposing your agency to liability for a lot of reasons. So this is where you have to think about what information is going where. So I liked this quote. This is the former White House CIO. We're still in the wild, wild west. We're all kind of trying to figure it out. Everybody's out there gunslinging, talking about AI. We haven't really figured out what the structure and the governance looks like. And that's why I want to talk with you today. Here's the kind of, I always like, this is like the boring stuff, but there are actual real legal stakes of poor data discipline. I want to get to the AI and all of the fun things that happen with the AI, but you should realize that all of this stuff that we're talking about, unstructured data, actually has a consequence. Many of you know this already, so this could be rote, but you do have NARA requirements. You have the federal rules of civil procedure that require you to not dispose of electronically stored information in an improper way. You have to preserve evidence. You can't have spoliation. FOIA requires you to have certain information preserved. There are privacy and security mandates around classified information and where that goes. We should all remember. So there are lots of reasons beyond what I'm talking about today that make it important that you think about data discipline. But I'm going to talk about something that's a step beyond that. Yes, these things are important. This is critical. But this is more about what can we really do with it that's exciting. So one of the biggest limitations that we have to getting the intelligence out of this information, to being able to do something with this information, is that these systems are disconnected and there is disconnected governance. I think we all love the idea of a centralized archive. However, what you're doing basically is creating a copy and extracting information out of all of these various systems, and you're creating a single point of failure and a lot of risk. And so I think in an ideal world, we're allowing that information to be connected somehow administratively in the systems in which it lives, and we're trying to pull information out of those silos. So if you think again about your agency, you have the SharePoint, you have Teams, you have different places. you need to have some sort of centralized control. And so you should be talking with someone that can help you apply centralized control over these various silos, and to also be able to extract the intelligence out of the information that lives in there. So indexing and pulling out metadata, textual data, the things that are going to give you that sort of nuanced information out of those silos. There are still a lot of manual workflows and governance gaps in the way that we think about this data. So a lot of us still in our agencies and in our companies are manually applying tags. We are not considering one hand when we think about the other. So we're thinking about FOIA, but we're not thinking about the FRCP. We're thinking about NARA, but we're not thinking about e-discovery requirements. So it's really kind of connecting the dots and making sure that as an organization, we're talking and bringing everyone to the table to make sure we're applying governance across all of this. We also have a lot of limited capabilities. So there are not very many tool sets, arguably very few, that can do governance across all of these silos and extract that intelligence without creating an additional copy, without moving at a snail's pace, without really kind of creating a sort of separate ecosystem that you have to manage beyond your everyday sort of tools. So ideally, you would be thinking about a tool or a system that helps you think through each of these to be able to extract out that information. So here are the solutions we want to think about to be able to start preparing our data for AI. You want to be able to unify disparate systems. You want to connect your email. You want to connect your SharePoint. You want to connect your teams. What does that look like? You have APIs, you have indexing. You need to be able to talk to those systems and apply governance and extract that information out across all of those different systems. So that's where you're looking for some sort of an end-to-end solution that's able to be worked across the various silos. You want to eliminate manual work as much as possible. We've heard a lot about auto-categorization. We want to be able to use the AI to actually start putting things in consistent buckets. All of this is going to matter for a reason I'll talk about in a minute. And then you want to go beyond some of the limitations of our current tools. I think we all leverage Microsoft, a lot of us do. One of the things that we should all be aware of are limitations in our current tool sets. Microsoft does a lot of things very well, and it does some things less well. One of those is that recently a special master's report indicated that Microsoft's search capabilities did not rise to the standards of defensibility for retrieval of records. That's because it was a system built for personal computing, not enterprise computing. And so it doesn't do a good job of unifying those silos, of pulling that all of that information together correctly in a way that's searchable and repeatable. And so you're really going to need to try to think about addressing that. So this was where I said the Wild West really needs a sheriff. So if we want to start thinking about AI in a meaningful way beyond having these exciting conversations where we say AI is great, it's the future, there are some steps that we need to take first. So the first thing that we really need to do is think about having clean, governed agency data to feed into the models. And I think one of the, I think pervasive themes I hear is we're relying on large language models. We're going back to the chat GPTs. But I don't think we've talked enough about the idea that small models may be better for a lot of agencies for a lot of reasons. There are some alternatives out there where you could feed agency-specific, clean, governed data into a smaller model. It's more energy efficient. It's more secure, and you're actually going to train the model on the nuances of your agency or organization. It's going to learn how you, as an agency, respond to requests and the tone that you respond to, and it's less likely to have bias and hallucinations that you'd see in LLMs. It's also less likely to expose you to privacy and security concerns as an agency. Smart governance also makes sure that AI gives you the best output. So you want the AI to be trained on relevant policies, not outdated policies or outdated legislation or outdated discussions. You should be feeding that model the information that's current and up to date so that you get current and up to date output. You need to get rid of all of the rot, and we heard about rot and sun this morning. You need to start thinking as an agency about removing redundant, outdated, and trivial data. And that's not just for AI. This is because if you're thinking about all of the sort of visibility into the government right now, people are making requests and looking for information that maybe doesn't need to be exposed because it should have been deleted 10 years ago. And so it's really starting to think about getting rid of some of this clutter out of your agency and limiting the exposure that you have for lots of reasons. And then you also need to be able to track every trail. You need to be able to justify the information that you put into the model, where it came from, why it was there, who it belongs to. I had a really interesting conversation at a dinner with some IC folks the other day. They were talking about the challenge within the IC community of the fact that by nature, everything is supposed to be sort of compartmentalized and secured and separated, but they're trying to explore the LLMs. What are they doing? They're trying to put information in a data lake. What does that do? That breaks down those silos and that secure sort of barrier. And so I heard from them, the thing that we're forgetting is to be Intel analysts first and innovators second. And so you really do need to think about the information and where it lives and how it gets into the model. How am I doing on time? So let's move into the cool part. So I said from archives to AI Advantage. Archives is kind of an outdated topic, I think. Now it's really about like data or records. We're beyond making a copy in a lot of ways. But how do you move from the sort of raw data or unstructured data into an AI advantage? So companies have tons of data. We know it, it's there, but it's not about just collecting all of this information. It's what you do with it and how you get insights out of it. So we don't care that you just have a copy. What could you do if you were able to really start leveraging those insights from your agency? And if we think about it within the context of some of us as professionals in this room, you can get instant answers that are tailored to your area. If you're in the VA, these are answers about all of the different healthcare decisions that have been made, the policies that impact the VA, veterans issues that are probably not represented holistically in a large language model. So you would be able to pull answers instantly from all of those documents that are tailored to you. You may be able to auto draft FOIA responses and not just auto draft them in a way that was just like a templated version, but in a tone specific version with different call outs that your agency tends to use or exemptions that are common. These are ways that you might be able to sort of superpower your FOIA responses. You also can spot trends before they escalate. So I think I want to talk about this in a couple of ways. We're hearing a lot about efficiency auditing at agencies. What I don't hear a lot about is the agencies preparing to counter the efficiency auditing and thinking about ways that we can come back as agencies and say, let me show you exactly how my personnel are doing the things that they need to do. Let me show you exactly where we're impactful. Let me show you trends in the ways that the grants that we've been awarded have been effective. There's all sorts of things that we would be able to do as agencies if we were starting to extract that trend data. It also helps us to eliminate inefficiencies internally as they arise. So you start to see maybe these positions or these areas have not been as effective as we'd hoped. We see this from all of this information. Let's start making some changes there. So there's lots of incredible sort of internal operational information that we could get. And then that's also sort of supporting your staff. One of the biggest issues I think we have everywhere is onboarding new people, keeping our employees plugged into the culture, making sure that they sort of have the support that they need, especially in sort of a less hierarchical world now. So you want to give teams AI that knows your agency's structure and history and can kind of trade accordingly. So I think all of this to say, so we're excited, there's this idea, I want you to walk away from this thinking about the fact that all of us are sitting on a treasure trove of intelligence and information that I don't think most of us are actually addressing and extracting information from. So you should start thinking about that unstructured data landscape. And here's where I think it gets very important to connect some dots. What I hear is there's records managers, and then there's a chief data officer, and then there's an AI innovation officer or someone like that. Everyone should be sitting down at the table to talk about what are your goals for AI. Let me as a records management manager tell you where all of that information sits and what we need to do with it. And then me as the chief data officer talk about how we manage that from a security and compliance perspective, and we pull all of that together. Somebody's phone's ringing. So then you just want to make sure, I think that's one of my biggest things is let's break down a silo there. Let's bring everybody to the table and let's talk about that data landscape. Let's also think about piloting some kind of a unified archiving system, something that helps bring all of that information together, that helps break down the data silos themselves so that you can access that information, pull out the intelligence, start identifying key pieces of information and using that for AI. Here's where I do a little minor plug for my company, ZL Tech. We can help there. And then I think it's building towards AI readiness. So you want to set up your foundation for well-governed data, know where that data lives, have all of the stakeholders together, and then make a plan for what do we do with AI? What are the use cases of AI that we have? How are we going to feed that AI and what's its purpose? And that again will inform what data and where it comes from and who needs to be at the table. And that is it from me.
Angela, excellent presentation. I haven't asked the question today.
Yeah.
So you said, I think you used on your slide, unseen majority, and
Yes.
that was the 80 to 90% is unstructured. So can you just go, and this might be a complicated question, but
No, it's okay.
how do you get that to your other slide that said cleaned and governed data? So how are you getting 80, 90% that you said some agencies don't even know where it's sitting?
Right.
How do you go from there to clean and govern data in a way that you can use these tools to get productive outcomes?
I think that's part of that sort of bringing the stakeholders to the table. So your records manager needs to sit down and sort of start thinking about, also I think almost with your mission-driven resources, where are all of the places that we are talking and storing information and creating business records or records in general. And then you need to develop policies around, all right, based on where all of this information lives, what are the things that sort of govern what we do with it? Do we have NARA obligations? Do we have FOIA obligations? Do we have e-discovery obligations? And come up with a retention policy together. So that you're able to sort of think through all of the different ways that you would govern that data. And then I think from there, once you've developed the policy around where the data is retained, defensible deletion, and how it's managed, you could start thinking about where you might start moving it for AI purposes.
I could ask your question. Is there a question back there? Well, here, while I'm walking back, no one sits near me. Maybe I should sit in the back. Nope. I'm going to walk back.
I can hear.
I need the exercise.
So when you were talking about cleaning up the clutter, right? And we do talk, and I saw like that exponential graph of like the amount of data that we are collecting. To what extent I know we're focusing a lot on the back end, but what about that front end of figuring out what truly needs to be collected and like kind of the governance around that to sure we're not just collecting junk? Like what truly needs to be captured to kind of also minimize or reduce that like inflow?
I think that's also where you have to sort of work backwards because that depends, right? So my answer would be if you're doing that from say an e-discovery lens, what you're collecting or what you're getting rid of is one thing versus the FOIA lens or the NARA lens. I think here what I'm talking about is even a step beyond that. You have all of those obligations for privacy, security, compliance, but if you're cleaning up for AI, you're actually addressing it for a different purpose. So there you might want to sit down and say, what is the AI use case that I have? What kind of model am I going to deploy and what am I hoping to receive as an output from that model? And that might help inform the way that you want to sort of extract information from your organization, clean it up, and sort of go from there. Does that help? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's also, you have to think about, like, I guess there's different questions around what's a business record, what's something that's FOIA-able, what's something that is a potentially like a record that could be seen in litigation, is it a capstone official? So I think what you would want to do is sit down and have a list of all of the considerations that could potentially come up and use that to help sort of determine the way that you potentially started to clean it up.
Over here, Angela.
Yes.
Yeah, a little bit concerned, and I think you would share this concern about the mosaic effect and the reality that you may be able to create connections that would expose, individuals or entities, regulated entities, et cetera, to sharing information that should not be broadly available. And that you need to protect the identities and the information you have around entities like citizens, so that you cannot, understand too much beyond what you need to know. So how do you handle that kind of requirement of also creating some stratification in that conversation?
Yeah, I think again, so I guess again, that's where I'm saying that it depends on what you clean up and what you govern. That would end up becoming a consideration if you were thinking about AI output. And I think that's one of the things we think about in an IC capacity. For example, if you're pulling in a record that's a classified, secure compartmentalized information or classified, that becomes something you need to think about. Everyone's done it all day, and I just did it finally. That should become a part of what you think about as you do your planning. So if you don't want to have that exposure, it's either that information doesn't go into the model, or the output and the access to that model is limited only to those people that have the need to know or the right to have access to that information.
I'm going to ask the last question here, and if someone has a question, will you be here for a few minutes?
Yes.
And I was looking, was that a 2003 survey with that 80 to 90%?
No, it was
I mean, 23.
2023. Yes, that's correct.
Because I think one of the bigger challenges, I call it the C soup, having been, I remember when chief data officers had to come in. Gosh, I go back to when CIOs were coming in. So you have CIOs, chief technology officers, then you have the legal staff, the FOIA staff, the records staff. And now we have a chief artificial intelligence officer. And it was many years ago, Lisa Haralumpus was downtown, and she said, the big issue is going to be who owns the data. So looking at 2023, there were chief artificial intelligence officers in agencies. There were CDOs in agencies, CIOs. I'm sorry to focus on that.
No.
I still think that's an incredibly large number with all these C-level executives in agencies. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's, again, where I'm a little bit concerned that it seems as if there's a disconnect between those various C-level professionals. So what I'm hearing about, and I hope I'm addressing this correctly, but when I talk to a lot of the chief AI officers, they're not necessarily talking to the people in records management or this, and they're probably talking to the CIO because they have to from a sort of technical perspective. But I do not hear a lot of consideration being granted to the sensitivity of the information, the relevance of the information, and having those. So I think what we're seeing is we think that these are siloed positions, that the chief AI position is very different from the CIOs, it's different from the chief data officers, and in reality, they're all, I think, inextricably linked, and they would be more effective if they were speaking to each other and sort of co-combining their missions.
Please give her, she's always one of the better presenters, very knowledgeable. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you. Thanks for the technical.
Okay, our closing session there he is. With us, we have 3 FOIA veterans joining us. And the session title is Innovative Approaches to FOIA, Achieving More with Limited Resources. Topic of the day.